My name is Tom Holmes. As the chair of the University of Minnesota Department of Economics, I'm here to welcome you on behalf of the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute, which has the mission of building a bridge between the leading edge economic research that happens here on campus to the business leaders, policymakers, community members, and government officials who can benefit from this research. We fulfill this mission through events like this and with public focused communications, including the office hours podcast, policy briefs, and of course, investing in rigorous research done by our top University of Minnesota economists and students, all with the goal of influencing real world economic policy decisions that promote the common good. We're excited to welcome you to this pop-up event, which promises to be a very engaging conversation. We're joined by economists, policymakers, journalists, students, faculty, and others interested in understanding economic issues. Along with those of you in this room, we are joined by many guests tuning in virtually. Thank you for being here. Our event tonight is Taxes, Tariffs, and Trade, Economic Policy in the Once and Future Administration. Today, we'll hear from two distinguished panelists who will discuss key trade-offs policymakers and community leaders should consider related to these issues. Allow me to briefly introduce our panelists so we can get started. Chris Phelan is the interim director of the Heller-Hurwicz Institute. He's a faculty member and former chair here in the Department of Economics and a consultant with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Tim Kehoe is the distinguished McKnight University professor here in the Department of Economics. He's a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a consultant at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Please join me in welcoming our panel, and now over to Chris.
Great, thank you. So I want to properly get expectations low. So what I mean by that is this is a pop-up event. We found that they're some of our most well-attended events. And what we mean by a pop-up is like there's pop-up restaurants or something. We have events in the spring and the fall, usually on a set topic associated with one of our faculty's research or an outside expert's research. These pop-up events are something happens in the world and there's sudden interest in it, and maybe we have an expert. So last spring, I think it was, when Silicon Valley Bank died, we did have people who had worked on banking, specifically Professors Chari and myself. And today, a lot of stuff's coming up with trade. It's hitting the news a lot. And we have an expert on trade, Professor Kehoe. And we also have someone else who's not an expert, but willing to talk anyway, me. So the format for this event is, I went over this, what would be, or Tim and I thought would be a nice format, which Tim would just outline some basic issues that he thinks are in the news now. Then I'm going to come back and talk about kind of what I think all economists agree and disagree on, and what I think Tim and I will agree and disagree on. Then Tim's going to make a case for free trade, and I'm essentially going to make a case for the exceptions to free trade. And then we'll talk back and forth, and then we'll invite the audience in. All right, so that's the format for this. And now I'm going to go over to Tim to just outline what you think the basic issues going on in the news with what I call the once and future administration.
Good. There's a lot of issues, Chris, but I'm going to keep it simple. The U.S. has had a very mixed history in terms of trade policy. But even so, the proposed policies of the Trump administration, incoming Trump administration, is a pretty big break with what we've had since the end of the Second World War. So let me just go over that a bit. You know, up until the Second World War, the United States had fairly high tariffs. They started in the 1790s under Alexander Hamilton at around 20% on manufactured goods imported from the rest of the world and not particularly directed at one country or another. And then over time, during the early industrial period of the United States up until the Civil War, the tariffs rose to about 60%. And it's worth remembering that caused a kind of pre-Civil War event in 1832 when the government of South Carolina refused to enact U.S. Tariffs. They called them the abominable tariffs of 1828 that the U.S. Congress had set. And Andy Jackson was the president. He was a Southerner. In many ways, he was an anti-tariff guy. The South was against tariffs. That was one of the issues. It was to protect industry in the North. And but he sent federal troops and got South Carolina to back down on that. But you know, it's not to say that the U.S. didn't use high tariffs at some points in its history. In fact, early in the Republic, tariffs were a major source of revenue. This will come up again because I think it's wild to think we can get trillions of dollars of revenues from tariffs, but I promised you I wouldn't get my views in yet. This is just a reporting, you know, anyone who saw a highway patrol in the old days, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. So that's what I'm going to try to give you. You know, so World War II was a turning point. And the United States then became, up until, from the end of World War II up until the first Trump administration, became the major country in the world trying to promote free trade. In 1944, the Allies, who looked more and more like they were going to be victorious, they started calling themselves the United Nations. They had this Bretton Woods agreement, which was going to try to establish what the world economic order would look like following the Second World War. And at that conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, they set up the IMF to control exchange rates, keeping countries from getting into devaluation wars. The World Bank to promote development in less developed countries. And then the participants noted, in fact, it was, not sure if this is good or bad, it was John Maynard Keynes who said, well, why aren't we discussing trade? Well, because they didn't have the appropriate officials from the government there, but they set up a plan for something they called the International Trade Organization. Harry Truman, who was president, got power from the Congress in 1945, and this is an important issue of trade policy since then. He got power from the Congress that he could negotiate the terms of the International Trade Organization, and Congress only had the right to accept or reject. That you couldn't go through individual clauses because they thought that would be impossible with trade agreements. And then it looked like the International Trade Organization was sailing ahead. They had something first called the Havana Charter, the GATT, which was just a preliminary agreement called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Finally, the whole thing got to the U.S. Congress in 1948, and Truman just got the message it wasn't going to go. So it's not like this whole kind of thing wasn't controversial at one point or another. But the GATT, somehow, instead of just being a preliminary agreement, became the World Trade order for 50 years. And it assumed the status of an organization, and it had rounds that kind of lowered tariffs all around the world from an average of over 20% to under 5%. Okay? But you know, the GATT started running out of gas in the 1970s and 80s. There were successive rounds. People of my age remember we talked about the Tokyo round, the Uruguay round. And in fact, there was an early Geneva round in the 1960s that John F. Kennedy pushed through. And when he died, they called it the Kennedy round. And these were lowering of tariffs all over the world. Then in 2001 in particular, something called the Doha round started. And if anyone's curious, it hasn't ended officially. They never could get much out of it. Big issue is agricultural trade. And the US and developing countries, led by Brazil, were really pushing for free trade in agriculture, and Europe and Japan were opposed. And so that wasn't where the action was. The GATT made an exception for what they call preferential trade agreements. And the big one, of course, we all know about is the European, the coal and steel community became the European Economic Community, European Union. And it's more than just a free trade agreement. But here in North America, we had the North American Free Trade Agreement became now President Trump negotiated it with Canada and Mexico, and it's called the Mexico-Canada, USMC Free Trade Agreement. Okay. Up until President Trump, US presidents since Truman were pushing for free trade throughout the world. What was the idea? The idea was why the Allies pushed this in 1945. We don't want the trade wars of the 1930s, that the US was one of the villains in with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, to cause international tensions. Okay. That's why we haven't had trade wars. Economists look for examples, like the breakup of Czechoslovakia, where two halves of a country started charging tariffs on each other. That was the kind of example we had until President Trump started the US-China.
Who's providing us data?
Yeah, well, I am. And I tell my students, as citizens of the world, this is very troublesome. However, as economics researchers, this is providing a fantastic amount of data. All right, so what is happening now? Let me say, although I know the Professor Phelan, my friend Chris, and I disagree on politics, I supported or have supported President Biden on a number of things, not on continuing the trade war with China. I find that to be a disgrace. I think, and I'll make the case later, that there's a value to free trade. But right now, if you go to Washington, all of the professional economists who kind of hang out there to get jobs consulting and so forth, they're not speaking up in favor of free trade. So that has changed, and it's changed in the last 8 years.
Okay, thank you, Tim. So what I said in my prefatory remarks was I'm going to now try to outline what I think most economists agree on and disagree on when it comes to this issue. And the disagreement parts are probably where Tim and I disagree. So I have a joke that I make, and it's like all jokes, half a joke, which is that economists don't like to disagree in front of to argue in front of the children, which is, you know, what I mean by that is trade is the source of all wealth. I give this argument to my in principles of macro class. Imagine that Minnesota was the world, that at the border of Minnesota was just ocean, and then the ocean just covered the rest of the world, and there was just Minnesota. What kind of standard of living could we have? We'd have to make all our own steel, our own computers, our own cars, our own food, just everything would have to be made in Minnesota. And it's unclear to me that we could even support our own population. We might, I think probably we might be able to support an 1800s level of standard of living. But you know, what you see, this, everything is trade. And so we have this natural inclination to say trade is good. Let's keep the party line going, that trade is good. But we also know that there are 5 or 6 exceptions to free trade. You know, theoretical and empirical exceptions to free trade. And the big thing that economists tend to differ on is the importance of those exceptions. As an empirical matter, are they big or are they small potatoes? And so that's my outline of what I think the argument is among economists, which is if you write down any kind of normal theory, just tariffs are bad. By the way, we didn't say what a tariff was. It's a sales tax on a foreign good, period. End of story. It's a sales tax that you just say, if you buy it from somewhere outside the country, you have to pay the sales tax. If you don't, you don't. So Tim, what do you think you have argued as this nonsensical thing that is of being a citizen of the world, that we should have free trade? What is the best arguments for why we should have free trade as an economist?
So my wife, and there's a number of people here who know my wife, who's a very distinguished historian. She has the same cold that I have, and she's sensible enough to stay at home right now. But she said, you know, Tim, I studied economic history a bit, but it was kind of boring. There was only one big event. And that is roughly true. It was the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution occurred, well, there were little bits of it starting the end of the 18th century, but it was really the first part of the 19th century in England. So a little more broadly in what's now Great Britain. Now, some economists say, why didn't it happen in the 13th century in China? And that's an interesting debate. But so there's this thing where there was sustained growth that was generated. Before that, and I like historians, and there's debates among them, the world was poor. The whole world was just poor, with a few isolated rich people. Okay, you were one bad harvest away from starvation everywhere in the world. Okay, that changed in 1790 to 1835, something like that, in England. 1960. Half the world's population lived in countries that still had never had a period of growth like England did in the early 19th century. Now 95% of the world's population has. Now the majority of the world's population is what the World Bank would classify as middle income. And there was an economic miracle that took place. And that I think people want, I call it globalization, right? Half the Chinese, half the Indian population became world middle class. And that was trade, foreign investment, at least during some periods, it was migration. It was technology diffusion. And I think we got to keep that up.
Can I go? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to make a general point what I think the issues are. And I don't have a Trump hat, but if I did, just, it's on right now. And so one of them is, I use the Minnesota example because Minnesota is relatively small. What are we, 5 million people, something like that?
A little bit more.
Okay. But GDP in the United States, about 87% of it is produced and consumed in the United States. Imports and exports for us are about 13%. Now you do that for Minnesota, you're going to get a much bigger number. You do it for Minneapolis, you're going to get a much bigger number. The smaller the geographic area, the more important trade is. But especially when it comes to the world, the United States is a big place. What are we, 25, 30% of world GDP, something like that? I'm making a number up.
Yeah. It used to be, it's smaller now.
It's smaller now, okay. It's big. So the United States is about 87%. These are very rough numbers. Canada, though, about 32% of its GDP is trade. Mexico is closer to 40. So just trade is much more important to these countries than us.
No, but that's not imports plus exports.
No.
No.
This is just, I'm basically taking the average between imports and exports.
So those numbers are right.
Yeah, I'm taking the average between imports and exports. So I guess the way I would put it is free trade is really important to Mexico, really, really important to Mexico.
That's right.
Really important to Canada.
That's right.
And it helps us a bit.
Helps us a lot. But yeah.
All right. But now let me go through the, one of the things you kept saying, I mean, if I had my Trump hat on and you said how much free trade has helped China and India, I'd go, well, I'm not the president of China or India. What's in it for us? And I think that's a very Trumpian way of putting it. It's somewhat popular. But part of what I was saying, there's a laundry list of exceptions to free trade. So nobody thinks that we should be having free trade with Russia right now. Because, you know, the way we generally put it in the textbooks is you don't want to import your bullets. All right, the national security exception is you don't want to have a dependence on your military of your weaponry being provided by your enemy. Then you get into the very tricky thing of, okay, who's my enemy and what's necessary for national defense? And so I brought this up with my colleague Chari, and he made the nice quip, which was, yes, we need the strategic washing machine reserve, which is because one of the big first Trump administration things they did is they put a bunch of tariffs on washing machines from China. And I went, I'm not sure that that's so crazy. And he goes, well, there's a strategic reason to keep soldiers' uniforms clean. And I went, no, J.D. Vance brought this up a lot, which is there's a national security implication of just being able to make stuff. If you outsource all of your manufacturing, I mean, during World War II, you can't, so there's a guy I follow on Twitter that if you give him the headlamp of a car, he'll tell you, oh, that's a 67 Chevy. You just give him any little part, he'll tell you what it is. He'll never say that that's a 1942 Chevy, because they don't exist. There are no 1942 Chevys, because we just stopped making cars. We took our entire manufacturing capacity and turned it into making tanks and airplanes and everything like that. There are national security implications, at least theoretically or possibly, to not making anything. So that comes in. And then the last thing I want to bring up is there's a more macro national security thing, which is almost every time there are a lot of our students in here, we always assume when we're doing welfare that I always put it that we're all a bunch of selfish jerks. I care about me, you care about you, and in our models, that's the way it is. I don't feel good about you when you get richer. I don't feel bad about you, just don't enter. But usually we do the same thing with countries. If I'm a little bit richer and you're a lot richer, well, then we're both better off, end of story. But once you take national security into account, do we really get better off when China gets richer? I mean, it's not clear to me at all that the United States is made better off, because that might mean we have to build more aircraft carriers. So there's once you start bringing into national security things get a lot more complicated. And I'll just preempt something that you're going to say, though, which is you are faced with the possibility that then everything becomes national security. Mohair restrictions. We still have mohair import restrictions because we need mohair to make soldiers' uniforms. That is a problem.
Okay. No, but let me just, I'm going to wait till I get
No, this is
going
your,
on it.
go.
Well, this is my zone now. Let me just explain what the importance of the national security exemption. So when we have to remember, the Constitution of the United States says that the branch of the government empowered with raising taxes and tariffs. And Chris is right. That's what tariffs are. They're nothing more than taxes on foreign trade. Is the Congress, in particular the House of Representatives. The president in the Constitution has no power to do it. But over the second half of the 20th century and recently, the president's taken more and more power. And the Trade Act of 1974 is sometimes cited for this. And that gives the president, if he declares a national emergency in some area, the power to set tariffs up to 15% on certain goods from certain countries that he specifies for up to 150 days. And then that power disappears. Then you say, what about these trade agreements? The GATT, the WTO, the NAFTA, now the Trump's, people gave up on calling USMC because they call it the NAFTA. But what the heck? I'll call it USMC.
Yeah, I called it Twitter.
Okay. I wasn't equating Trump with Elon Musk, but I see you are, so that's fine. All right. So look, the point is, what we're proposing are wild violations of those treaties we've signed. So they need an excuse, and there is one. There's something called the national security exception. If a government deems that it needs to set a tariff for national or other trade barrier because of national security reasons, then it can do so. That, up until President Trump's first administration, was a seldom and carefully used exception. Now it's used for everything. Whatever they're thinking of, the only legal excuse they have for it is national security exception.
Okay.
Okay, so but here's back to some facts. Tariffs on the U.S., on Canada and Mexico, our two largest trading partners. China for a while was. That's a 21st century phenomenon. For about the last 40 years of the 20th century, Canada was our biggest trading partner. It is again now For a few years ago, Mexico was our biggest trading partner, and China was from about 2005 to 2012, 13, something like that. Canada and Mexico, let's see, we want to promote U.S. automotive industry. There's no U.S. automotive industry. It's North American automotive industry. Every car you buy has Mexican, Canadian parts in it. All the pickup trucks in this country are assembled in Mexico.
I just bought a Tesla. I'll bet it's all United States.
Oh, I bet it's not.
All
I
right.
bet they have a.
They
Now,
might have Chinese batteries.
now let's even think about the talk about the tariffs. Claudia Sheinbaum, who was just inaugurated president of Mexico, just had a conversation last week on the phone with President Trump, and she came away saying, I talked to President Trump, I don't think we're going to have any troubles or any tariffs at all. So there's different messages going out there. So who the heck knows what's going to happen? But there's no such thing as a U.S. automobile industry. It's a North American automobile industry. I can go further down because that's the most traded good in North America. Second most traded good in North America is electronic equipment. Well, guess what? There's no U.S. electronics equipment industry. There's a North American electronics equipment industry with components, assembly done in all three of the countries. You see it.
You're absolutely right. A part will go from here, make a bigger part here, and then go back here and get made into an even bigger part. That's how
Right. Now-
automobiles are made.
Now, let me mention a better example of a national security exemption. We realized during the pandemic that all the chips that we were putting in our products, including automobiles, for example, were manufactured in Taiwan. And we have no problems with Taiwan at this point in time, but there were supply chain problems. So people made the argument that we need to have chip manufacturing in the United States. But once the pandemic kind of eased down, the supply chain problems disappeared. That didn't become so urgent anymore. I concede the point that there are national security exceptions that are valid. It's just that the Trump administration is going to have to use them for every single good they want to put a tariff on.
I agree. So do they.
Yeah,
Okay, so when we were discussing this, I promised our excellent associate director of the Heller-Hurwicz Economics Institute that I would keep this part to a half hour. I failed, but I've kept it to 34 minutes. And the rest would be just for questions and answers
sounds good.
from the audience. So, okay, go ahead. Is this Ellen McGrattan? Oh, wait for the
Mention their name.
Yes.
Okay.
Ellen McGrattan.
Yes, it is on.
Okay, Ellen McGrattan, Department of Economics. So we know that a lot of trade goes through the multinationals. What's planned for exemptions when our companies are trying to import?
No one knows. No.
What happened first time around? What happened in the once?
What happened in the first Trump administration, 2016 and 2020?
Oh, I don't think there were. The big tariffs the only tariffs on Mexico and Canada in the first Trump administration, and they were big, where there was a 10% tariff on steel and a 25% tariff on aluminum, and they were very disruptive. I don't know that there were major exceptions for that. They were disruptive here in northern Minnesota.
But I'm going to just clarify with I already know my answer, which is I don't know. But I want to know what the particular question is for the answer I don't know. So if you're asking if an American company has a subsidiary in another country and wants to bring within the company.
Almost all the automotive trade, and that's the biggest thing. No, that's going to be tariffed. There's no.
All right.
I suspect what Ellen may be thinking about is transfer pricing. When you're trading goods within subsidiaries of the same firm, the terms of that trade are set by the firm, and the Commerce Department has to take a position on whether it's fair or not. But I think the question was, to what extent, or one question, which is an interesting question, is to what extent did transfer prices adjust in response to these trade restrictions, so that you move the profits from one country to another?
I thought it was silly. Look, if GM has a windshield plant in Mexico, does it have to pay the tariff when the GM-owned windshield plant sells a windshield to the GM-owned assembly plant in Detroit? And the answer to that is I don't know. And what?
Oh no, they have to pay. And then you would say your question is a different question. In situations where there are tariffs, there are small tariffs between the United, but for trade within North America on automobile parts, that's not even a question, Shari, because there's no tariffs. Whether they'll put creative thinking into transfer pricing, because that's what we do between the United States and the European Union. When medical equipment companies in Minnesota export to the Republic of Ireland, which some years is Minnesota's biggest export destination, we charge the wholly owned subsidiary in Ireland, we charge them a very low price. And that means all the profits, when the Irish company sells it to Germany, Italy, whatever, stay in Ireland. And the Department of Commerce doesn't do too much about that. So you're saying, can the U.S. multinational get around some of the problems by putting all the profits in Mexico or Canada? That's leaving out, what if there's reciprocal tariffs? What if they end up, because the first thing was, as soon as Claudia Sheinbaum was, I follow Mexico quite a bit, you know, when she was inaugurated, she says if President Trump puts tariffs on us, we're going to reciprocate tariff for tariff. And so then there's going to be a mess, and then who's going to pay the tariff? So here's the evidence from the first trade war that's still going on. And I won't call it the Trump trade war like I used to. I'll call it the Trump-Biden trade war, because President Biden was responsible even for upping the ante in some areas. It's always a complicated question. When you put a tax, a sales tax, who pays it, the producer or the consumer? And then you have to do a demand analysis, what the alternative supplies and so forth. There's been 2 pretty good studies done on U.S.-China trade war. 90% of the tariffs were paid by U.S. firms or consumers. And those are the kind of numbers that I expect to see. So it is a sales tax on U.S. consumers.
Going.
Well,
Oh,
I have
go
a
ahead,
mic. I'll
Tom.
just finish this out and we'll
Sure.
move the mic to a different part of the room, I should say.
Well, yeah, we got all the econ
All right, but
professors there.
I-
We could talk about this over lunch instead of here, guys.
This is being left out of the discussion, I think is very important. There's a big difference between Alexander Hamilton convincing US Congress to legislate a uniform tariff for all imports and this thing we're going to be getting where Trump has, unilateral ability to just make whatever tariffs he wants and calls it national defense, meaning we basically have a spoil system where there's spoils to be handed out. If you go to Mar-a-Lago and kneel and kiss the ring, you can get a benefit. And if you don't, you don't. And that is not, this kind of crony capitalism is, all the research over it is never a good thing for growth, which is not going to be a good thing for national defense to have a screwed up economy that works this way.
I didn't hear a question.
Yeah,
All right.
Okay, I'm Jonas. I'm economics PhD student. So I would like to ask about inflation as a result of the tariffs. How should we expect it to come? So there is a view, and it was shared by the president of the Minneapolis Fed, for instance, that this is going to be a one-time shock in the inflation because once the price we are basically changing the price level, and once they adjust, then they're going to stabilize, and there is no more pressure in the inflation. My view, I think that once the inflation hits, the workers will start demanding higher wages, and I don't know if there will still be unions during Trump's second administration, but this can cause pressures on the wage, and this will lead to a spiral of inflation. So I'd like to know how do you think how should I expect the inflation to hit after a tariff shock?
Can I take this one?
yeah.
I would say that levels are caused by, changes in levels are caused by changes in levels, and changes in rate of changes are caused by changes in rate of changes. So what I mean by that is if you do one thing, the price level can adjust. But no, you're not going to get inflation, long-term inflation is prices going up and then up and then up and then up and then up. And a tariff could cause, if there's no change in productivity, correct me if I'm wrong, if there's, let's just say that the tariff causes a minor change in how productive we are. We produce things here that would have been produced in Mexico, but we're almost as good. There's very little comparative advantage. Then you're just going to see relative price changes. Some prices go up, some prices go down. If we just become poorer because we're giving up some efficiencies, then you're going to get a one-time price increase. Just from the fact that there's the same amount of money chasing fewer goods. But you're not going to get, unless you set off a speculative hyperinflation, which really there aren't very many good examples of in the history of the world. I would expect exactly what one of my bosses, so I have to say I'm a little financially conflicted here, would say. I would expect the tariff, there could possibly be a price increase from increase in tariff levels, but I wouldn't expect it to cause a price increase and a price increase and a price increase, which is what we call inflation.
That's right. And in principle, I agree with you. Although that's a good question, Jonas. Now, but let's think a little bit. This reminds me the story of what happened in the 1970s. A lot of you weren't around then, in the United States, where we had what was called stagflation. And there was a guy named Arthur Burns, a very distinguished academic economist, although he was very proud of knowing no economic theory, and you can see how that hurt him. But he refused to let, he was the chair of the board of governors of the Fed, and he refused to let his staff talk about the inflation that was being caused by the oil price increase. He said, no, those are just supply shocks. We're not going to alter monetary policy at all. So 2 oil price shocks, a bad decade. This can go on for a while.
We also printed a lot of money.
Well, he did. He did. But he's often thought of as the worst chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in history. So this could touch off
Sure.
all kinds of things. The Deutsche Bank, which I thought was in the business of clandestine lending to Donald Trump, but whatever. The head of Deutsche Bank Research just came out and said he doesn't expect to see the Fed lower the interest rates later this month because of the inflation they expect from the tariff increase. But Claudia Sheinbaum is telling the citizens of Mexico there's going to be no tariffs. So you see what I mean? There's a lot of
Yeah, you don't know.
uncertainty here.
Do we have any? Okay. I got lights in my eyes, so I
Yeah,
can't
we
really
can.
see when someone has their hand up.
Thank you. I'm Jorge. I'm from Mexico.
right.
And two quick questions. One is, if the argument is national security, then why threaten like very close and strategic allies like Canada or Mexico with these tariffs? That is number one. Wouldn't that increase like the tensions and eventually the need for more playing careers in military spending? And in the second one is, trade is important for intermediate goods, right? And if you want to actually produce absolutely everything in the United States and you want to start rebuilding cars or whatever, you're going to have to stop producing something else, right? Especially if your labor force is already very tight and unemployment is low. What are we going to, like, what, to start producing cars, like, what are people going to stop producing then?
I'm going to let you answer the second one. I want to answer the first one.
All right, go.
No. Oh. So the first one, I don't think when we put, so I've had different hats. I said I was going to put on my Trump hat, my economist hat. So let me put on the economist hat. Which countries belong in the class of adversaries and which countries belong in the class of friends is not a question you can answer when you have your economist hat on. That's fundamentally a political question. So now I'm taking the economist hat on and putting on my Make America Great hat, which I don't own, but let's say I did. If I did, it would be the black one, not the red one. Would work better with my pants. So I gotta put that one on, and I'm gonna pretend I'm Trump now. Who says Mexico's a friend? We had 73,000 fentanyl deaths last year. We had 10 million people come in the last 4 years with the aid of at least looking the other way, possibly with the aid of the Mexican government. Whether or not Mexico is acting as our friend or as an adversary, or at least indifferent to our welfare, is not an economist. I mean, I'm certainly Trump doesn't think that they're that friendly. And so he wants to say, okay, fine, we're going to, 25% tariffs on everything unless we see a little bit more cooperation on drugs and immigration.
No, and Jorge, that is the excuse. It's not national security in general. What it is it's drugs, particularly fentanyl, and illegal immigration. Now, Justin Trudeau, although he has tough times coming up politically himself in Canada, but Justin Trudeau says, don't equate the northern border with the southern border. I don't know. I just saw this in the Washington Post today. It was warning American consumers about beer prices because right now the most popular imported beer in the United States is Modelo Especial, which is actually a good beer. Unlike Corona.
I think that's the most popular.
Corona.
I think that's the most popular beer, not the most popular imported beer.
It is very popular. But this is another case of the North American beer industry. You know where they get all their hops is from North Dakota.
All right. How about you? Okay, you ask somebody. You're gonna have to go like this.
Oh,
Uh,
I can't really.
Here,
Here,
I-
there's a question
Oh.
over here. Or
Oh.
if there's someone there, let's do it. No, let's do it.
Yeah.
You have to understand, we really can't see.
Okay, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm Suna from PhD student and from the finance, and my question is like, because of the high tariff, now the multinational companies are moving their factories to United States. For example, Samsung and Hyundai.
I'm sorry, we're not hearing.
Samsung has moved its,
Yeah, Samsung and Hyundai is now moving their manufacturing system to United States. Like previously, if the manufacturer was in China, now it's moving to America. Do you think this kind of move actually practically benefit U.S.? Because for my expectation, the capital will go back to South Korea. So I was wondering, like, how should this dynamic will change?
so I guess the question is, a bunch of foreign companies are moving factories to the United States. The Japanese did that
Right.
in response to
No, particularly the car
car
companies.
companies.
No, but you have to understand something. One of the reasons that the Japanese car companies set up big plants, particularly in Kentucky and Tennessee, 20 years ago, all the Toyota Camrys in the world are manufactured in the United States. We export them to Japan. That's because they import lots of the intermediate goods from Japan. Now, I'm sure if there's a Korean company doing this kind of thing, the whole point is to try to import a certain amount of the goods from Korea and to get some political protection, like the Japanese wanted to get against high tariffs on the Japanese intermediate imports, because there's so many US employees involved in working it. I mean, that's a political game. It worked for the Japanese car companies. But it's just not clear to me what's going to happen here, or that that's a relevant example. If there's 25% across the board tariffs with no exemptions, they're already we just don't know where the exemptions are going to be. But if there's 25% across the board exemptions, then you don't even want to do stuff like that.
Chari?
VV Chari Economics. So Chris, I'll pose this as a question rather than a comment to get you to respond. The question is, have you got the national security argument exactly backwards? Let me elaborate on why I think you have gotten it exactly backwards. A trade war, there's only a short distance between a trade war and a shooting war. That has been true historically. All through history, when countries enter into arguments about trade, it often leads to war. An important reason for Hitler to start World War II was precisely trade wars, which led him to think that Germany was increasingly being isolated. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs, the tariffs imposed by the French, the reparations programs, all of these interruptions in trade convinced Hitler that unless he took over countries, unless he actually physically occupied them, he could not trade with them. He would not be able to trade with them. And this is true. I used World War II as an example, but it's true historically. I can come up with 15 examples off the top of my head. The visionaries who set up the agreements after World War II saw that very clearly. They argued that increased economic interdependencies through trade would reduce the possibility of shooting wars. Put technically, in the language that you were just using, the set of adversaries that you confront is endogenous. It is not some fixed set. These are adversaries, these are friends. Friends can become adversaries, and adversaries can become friends. For good or for ill, when Larry Summers and Bill Clinton got China to join the WTO, an important published motivation, and Larry Summers wrote extensively on this, was that the best way of reducing the possibility of a shooting war between the US and China, which is the biggest threat that the world confronts in lots of people's opinions, was to increase the amount of interdependency between China and the rest of the world. You may argue with that proposition, but that is the proposition that the world has proceeded on. Now you have a corrupt thief who is interested only in lining his own pockets.
He's going
All
to
right?
be.
Wait.
He's
Let me
ending on
finish,
January
and then
20th.
I'm gonna let you answer the question. Who I think Tom has it exactly right. This is entirely a device to induce crony capitalism in the center of democratic capitalism, Washington, D.C., because that's how he plans to enrich himself. And to even admit that there is a legitimate argument for this thief to make us all dramatically poorer and to pull us into a shooting war is I think it's not something that as decent citizens we ought to be engaging in. We should call it for what it is. It is a poor excuse for one person to enrich himself and his family, and we should not be in any way, shape, or form be supporting this kind of nonsense.
All right.
But the question again is, have you got the national security argument exactly backwards?
My answer is unsurprisingly, I don't think so. And so look,
But sorry, the point is the whole movement towards free trade, maybe I was incoherent, was based on the allies at the end of the war saying we don't want to have this happen again, so we need to have free trade.
okay, here's my thing, which is I thought you were an economics professor and a very good one. Nothing that you just said is economics. What you just talked about was foreign policy. What's the best way to keep countries from shooting each other? That's fine. I never took a course in that in graduate school, and neither did you.
Let me turn it into an economic argument, Chris. So as you know, I spend a lot of time with my friend Juan Pablo Nicolini, who I see is back here now. We just wrote a book on the modern economic history of Latin America. And we saw the kind of economic policies that are followed in Latin American countries, especially looking at this in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, where there were very restrictive trade policies with exceptions. And exceptions became a synonym for corruption.
Absolutely. This happens. You can come up with a laundry list this long of countries, including the United States, where this has happened.
And what
not disputed.
Right. And what do you think Elon Musk thinks where he sees the word exception?
Getting to Mars. This is going to be the last question.
We should conclude, but I do want to make one remark. I'm not the one who dragged foreign policy into economics. When you raise the national security argument for tariffs, you drag foreign policy into economics. And all I'm asking, I like to think I know economics. I don't know much foreign policy, but isn't it a possibility that you've got the foreign policy aspect of the economics exactly backwards?
Of course.
Let's have one more. Let's get one more question.
One more question.
Let's get one more question.
Up there.
Hi, I am Santiago, an economics PhD student. I have a question related to another position that President Trump have related to the BRICS position of a currency. If you have these tariffs and these imply any change in the trade in the world, you will also have a change in the capital exchange behind it. How do you think that these tariffs benefits or going against the position of holding the dollar as a main currency in the world?
Will it affect the dollar being the reserve currency? I don't see it. I don't see a lot of things, but I don't necessarily see the connection.
Look, the dollar started taking over the position of the British pound in the first half of the 20th century, when the United States was still a fairly high protectionist country. In fact, we went through the horrible period of the 1930s with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which were the highest almost of U.S. citizens. And we were still the world's reserve currency. You know, people predicted this, that the euro would take over the position as the world's reserve currency. And then someone commented after the EMU debt crisis in 2010, 2013. That means the dollar is going to be the world's reserve currency for the next 100 years. What's going to be what? The Chinese yen? I don't think there's a chance of that. And no other currency.
Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't see it.
Yeah, I don't see it.
All right. Well, on that, I will say we should say thanks to our panelists, Chris Phelan and Tim Kehoe. And of course, we appreciate the staff who assisted with the event tonight. I encourage you to visit the Heller-Hurwicz Economic Institute website for more economic research and policy briefs, including links to episodes of our podcast, Office Hours. This conversation will be made available as a special episode of our Office Hours podcast, so watch for that, and I bet you we're going to get some hits on that one. Thank you again for joining us tonight.